Boards first. Um, it turns out we're going to have more worship services, and at those worship services, like we've got the sermon lockdown, we know who's doing that, but we really need people to do opening prayers and communion. This is a new list, so far we have one person to do communion, but that's not an indictment on you because we have not passed it yet. So, you all right? It'll get you, man. It'll get you. So I'm going to pass this around. If you would help us out with opening prayer or communion, there are spaces under those. Write your name there on the date that you would like to do it. Make sure it lands somewhere we can find it in the room. Don't take it home with you. Brad started moving the cords because I kept walking around and almost falling. So you are not alone. That's right. I would have had you, man. We would have had you. We may get some of those inflatable cushions to put in front in case somebody falls. For the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about shame, and more importantly, the idea that shame is something that the gospel is meant to free us from. We pointed out the distinction between guilt and shame. Shame is, and these are the psychological definitions they've come out with now, shame has to do with this sense that there is something wrong with me, something that makes me unworthy of love and connection with other people. And it causes us, the more that we feel that way, it causes us to project an image. It causes us to not connect with people. And if people like the image we project because we're pretty good at it, it's also crushing because we know what they like isn't really us. So shame says, you know what? At the end of the day, I just am bad. What would people expect from somebody like me? On the other hand, there's guilt. And guilt is actually a healthy emotion. Guilt is connected to actions. Guilt means I did something wrong and I need to address that. Or I failed to do something good and I need to address that. Guilt is actionable. You understand what I'm saying? Guilt says I did something bad or I failed to do something good and it needs to be addressed. Shame just says I am bad. And people still try to shame people into better behavior, but the psychological experiments say, the psychological research says, actually that's not connected to any positive outcomes. None. It actually, shaming people, making them go deeper into that just I am bad thing, actually is correlated with higher levels of the negative behaviors that we want them to move away from. Guilt, understand it like this. Guilt works like pain works in your body. And while we generally don't like pain, we'd be in trouble if we didn't have it because pain's what tells you something's wrong, you need to fix it. Right? Shame is like a chronic version of pain where all the nerves are firing at the same time and pain can't even function the way it's supposed to. You can't follow it out to see the thing you need to address because it's just all pain. And while our society at large does not have a communal concept of of sin, like they did in the time of the Bible, and you don't have to take my word for it, you can look that up. Judaism, Christianity provided some specific content and nuance, but there was a broader context where the basic context of sin was understood. Several people argue persuasively now that that broader concept doesn't exist in our society anymore, that it's thought of as a very religious church term and probably specifically Christian term, that's something that you guys deal with, but we don't have any connection with it. And so I read a really good argument by a guy named Alan Mann who says, so maybe in order to culturally translate what was going on, what they were communicating in the time of the Bible, in order to culturally translate it so that it makes sense to people now like it did then, so it carries the meaning now that it did then, maybe we should start talking about the gospel is meant to free us from shame. Now, down the road, in conversation, you'll be able to have conversations about sin and they'll make sense. But in order to connect with the society at large with the power of the gospel, by and large, they don't know what you're talking about when you talk about sin. They mostly think of it as, okay, there's a list of your rules that I haven't signed off on that I'm breaking except for they weren't my rules. So it seems like you just want me to stop doing it so you can be comfortable because you don't like seeing it. But instead, we talked about before that sin, the Greek word is hamartia. It means to miss the mark. It started out as more of an archery term than a religious term. There's also a sense that it's used in the theater that says it's some basic character flaw in somebody that ultimately leads to their downfall that's usually linked to things like hubris and arrogance. So that's the idea of sin. It is connected to action like guilt. So guilt is meant, the gospel frees us from shame and allows us to interact with guilt in a way that's actually healthy, to move forward, to move towards better things. The blood of Jesus, yes, washes us clean, erases our past. So God says that your sins are cast as far as you from the east is from the west. It says God will remember them no more. And since God is omnipotent and God is trustworthy, when he says he'll remember them no more, it's not just a slick turn of phrase. The God of all things can make himself remember them no more. To where you would say to God, but what about this? And he would go, I don't know what you're talking about. Honestly. So, the gospel frees you from your past sins, from the sense that you're unworthy, from the sense that there's something fundamentally wrong with you. It clothes you with Christ. It credits righteousness to you. And it allows God to mold you like clay into the image of Jesus. You are set free from the bondage of sin, from shame. And you are made new to walk the path towards God. And when guilt enters in, it's because you understand who we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to interact with the world, and we can address those things and move forward by the power and grace of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm trying to attack this from a couple of angles. And today, we're going to start by talking about a string of parables. The first two are very short. And then there's a third one that's a little bit longer. If you've been around much at all, you know that A, I love talking about parables. I adore them. And number two, part of the reason I adore them is because I don't think they work like fables. They're not just an earthy story with a heavenly meaning and a moral. There are stories like that, but that's not how parables function. Parables, particularly the parable of Jesus, are more like a M. Night Shyamalan movie where it starts out and you think you know what's going on, and somewhere in the middle, the whole thing, there's this plot twist that turns everything upside down, or maybe we were upside down, it turns everything right side up, and you're like, I call them, that was a technical term. I call them disruptive fiction or unsettling stories. They're meant to disrupt where you're comfortable so you can hear the truth. Now, before I get to parables, I'm going to reference a movie. Possible spoiler alert, although this movie was released in 1999, so yeah, I gave you plenty of time. This is not an official endorsement by the North Augusta Church of this R-rated movie, although talking to the individual members of the North Augusta Church, it almost could be. I want to talk about this scene because when I first saw this, like when it first came out, there was this scene, and I liked the movie. There was a lot of action. There was a lot of stuff. But there was this scene, and it really grabbed me. And I'm going to change words in one place where they say the Matrix just to make it the more general thing that they were pointing to, that it's sort of metaphor for. But there are these two characters that are together, and there's this one character played by Keanu Reeves named Neo who's figuring out that there's something weird in the world they can't figure out, and it won't leave him alone. And he finally meets with this shadowy guy named Morpheus, who's going to explain some things to him. And whatever he thought was going on, what actually is going on is so much bigger than that. But this is the conversation they have. They sit down and Morpheus says, "Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind driving you mad. It's this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you want to know what it is?" Neo nods. Morpheus goes on and says, "It's everywhere. It's all around us, even now in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It's the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. Neo says, what truth? And Morpheus responds, that you are a slave. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch, a prison for your mind. Now, can you feel that? When you look at the world today, when you look at the way that you're feeling, can you feel that scene? And it's talking about sort of the imaginary world of that movie, but it's a metaphor for something that we all feel in the world. There are stories that have been pulled over our eyes. And let me be very clear, the way that human beings make meaning, the way that human beings find truth, access truth, is by story. It's the way that we understand it. We want to know what story we find ourselves in. We want to know other people's stories and how they inform ours. We want to know the story of a nation, of a people. I'm going to suggest to you that precisely to combat the bondage of sin, and that's really the metaphor I'm using there when we use shame. I'm talking about the bondage of sin. But if you want to understand, if you want to get free from the grip of that, then we've got to believe better stories than the ones that we've been believing. We've got to believe better stories of how the world works and how God works and who God is. And I'm going to argue that in this string of stories I'm about to tell you, that's exactly what Jesus aims to do. Now, I'm going to give you the setup. It's one of the parables where we get a setup. If you want to follow along in the YouVersion Bible app on your phone or tablet, you can do that by opening the Bible app, going to Events. We'll be at the top of the list. Pick us. There's the notes. Also, at the bottom of those notes, there is a link to our online giving portal if you want to use that. We're going to start in Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 1. Tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. Side note, isn't that interesting? Tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. This made the Pharisees and the teachers of the religious law complain that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. So Jesus told them this story. Now that's fascinating to me for a number of reasons, and we don't have time to go into all of them. I also like at the very end where it goes, here's the situation. There are all of these tax collectors and notorious sinners. Can't even just say sinners, notorious sinners. Everybody knows they're sinners. That often come to hear Jesus preach. They're not sneaking into where these people are and like having a pop-up sermon to surprise them and then they're trapped. They're coming to him. Again, if we claim to follow Jesus, if we claim to be the body of Christ, we really ought to look at how different kinds of people interacted with Christ. And if we're not getting the same interactions, we should ask ourselves some questions. If the people who tend to get mad at Jesus are happy with us, we should ask some questions. If the kind of people who loved Jesus somehow see us as an enemy, we need to ask ourselves some questions. So that's the setup. Also like that it says he told them this story, and then it follows with 3 stories. Now, that's funny on one hand. On the other hand, I think it's because even though it's 3 stories, it's the same story. It's the same plot line. And they give it to you 3 ways so you get the big picture. So here's how he starts. This is Jesus talking. He says, if a man has 100 sheep and one of them gets lost, what will he do? Now, I'm going to imagine that they all have an idea of what he should do. But he says this, won't he leave the 99 others in the wilderness and go search for the one that's lost until he finds it? And when he's found it, he will joyfully carry it home on his shoulders. And when he arrives, he will call all his friends and neighbors together, saying, rejoice with me because I have found my lost sheep. In the same way, there is more joy in heaven over one lost sinner who repents and returns to God than over 99 others who are righteous and haven't strayed away. So here's what Jesus says. All right, a bunch of you guys are shepherds, so you know how this works. Guy's got 100 sheep and one of them wanders away. Which one of us wouldn't leave the 99 sheep unattended in the wilderness to go find the one that went away? And then when we find it, wouldn't throw them up on her shoulders and immediately go home and call everybody and throw a party. Side note, where are the 99 sheep? They're still in the wilderness. I mean, this is a hard thing to get your mind around. It seems so wrong to us, and it's supposed to, because even our songs betray us sometimes. There's a song that I really, really love by Andrew Peterson, who I adore and think is a brilliant lyricist and a very smart guy, but this lyric always bothers me because the lyric starts, there were 99 that safely lay basically in the fold. The idea, and it's one that you've gotten, you've probably even seen pictures of it, that they leave them safely in the fold and there's other people watching them and he goes out and finds it. That is not what the story says. They are in the wilderness. He leaves them in the wilderness. He was the one watching them to go find the one sheep. And when he finds the sheep, what does he do? Well, he takes it back to the rest of the herd and he takes them all back home and he gets them in the pen and then he throws, no, that's not what it says. He even uses the word immediately. He throws the lamb on his shoulders, goes home, calls everybody he knows, throws a party while 99 sheep are still in the wilderness. And so everybody there listening goes, oh yeah, we know what he'll do. He'll call some of his workers in, they'll watch the sheep, and he'll go send somebody to find it. And Jesus is like, which one of us wouldn't leave 99 unattended in the wilderness and go find the one and then go home and throw a party? And they're like, none of us would do that. That's crazy. We could accept a 1% loss. Literally, it's the first time I've ever got that percentage right preaching this sermon. It's the most easy thing in the world, and I've blown it multiple times. We can accept a 1% loss. A 99% loss to reclaim the one, or at least the possibility of a 99% loss to reclaim the one, seems unwise. It seems reckless and irresponsible, and Jesus goes, yeah, I know, God's like that. Maybe he doesn't understand the value of the sheep. Or maybe he does. But because he knows he's confused everybody, and he throws this in and goes, guys, you need to understand that in the presence of God, there's more rejoicing over one sinner that repents, one person who has strayed, one person who has walked the wrong path, who comes back into the way of Jesus, who accepts the grace and forgiveness that God's wanted to give them the whole time. There's more rejoicing over that than 99 who never left. But they're still stuck on the other thing about the 1% and the 99%. It just doesn't make good economic sense. And Jesus goes, yeah, I know God's like that. But then he keeps going. He tells this other one. And if you thought that one was weird, check this one out. Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Won't she light a lamp and sweep the entire house and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she will call all her friends and neighbors and say, rejoice with me because I have found my lost coin. In the same way, there is joy in the presence of the angels when even one sinner repents. All right, so new story. You didn't get the sheep, maybe you're not a shepherd. Well, we all know about money. Let's talk about money. A woman has 10 silver coins. Now, commentaries are hilarious to me sometimes. They're very helpful in other times. But on things like this, they're hilarious to me. Because you'll read through and you'll find some note and some, if you have similar ones I've seen, that says, well, women at the time had this ceremonial headdress that was made of coins, and if they lost one that was really expensive, it was like a year's wages or something, and blah, 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 blah. My problem is it doesn't say that. There's no indication at all of it. If they had that and they knew what it was, seems like he would have mentioned it if that's what he meant. What he said is 10 silver coins, which in our vernacular is 10 silver coins. And she loses one. Now watch this, here's another percentage. So she's got a 10% loss. But it's coins. I don't know what the actual value was, but it's coins. So let's say you had 10 coins and you lost one. Which one of you wouldn't? Sweep out all your house, tear up the carpet, move all the furniture out into the lawn until you found the one coin that was lost. And then, when you find it, would call all of your friends and throw a party, a celebration as you rejoice that probably cost more than the value of the coin. By the way, I'm saying this again to illustrate how much rejoicing there is over one sinner that returns to God. And they're still like, none of us would do that. That's crazy. You'd end up spending more than you lost. And Jesus goes, yeah, I know, God's like that. But then in case they didn't get it, he comes in with this last one. And I need you to remember, because it's been 2 parables since we saw the setup. But the setup is, there are notorious sinners and tax collectors that are coming to hear Jesus because they want to hear Jesus. There are Pharisees and religious leaders who are standing around judging Jesus because of who wants to hear him. And the fact that he actually eats with them, ooh. And so Jesus tells this story, which is actually 3 stories. And yes, part of the story, part of the intended audience of the story are those tax collectors and notorious sinners who have come to hear him. But a big thrust, and the reason you give it that setup, is because part of his audience is the Pharisees and the religious leaders who are judging them and him for it. Now, hear it through those ears. So then we get to a story of sons. Now, you're familiar with this parable. It's been told, it's been depicted in art, it's been used to build other stories off of. It's a very, very famous story. You've got a wealthy landowner who's done really well for himself. He has 2 sons that live there, an older one and a younger one. And one day, the younger one comes to his dad and says, all right, Dad, I'd like to go ahead and get my inheritance, please. Now, that's interesting for a number of reasons. One of them being, I realize that our legal system isn't exactly like theirs, but in general, when do you get an inheritance? After the guy dies. Since he's being asked, not dead. So his dad's still alive. Oh, another thing that's interesting in their culture is the way that it tended to work was when the father died and you had 2 children, 2 sons, and one was older, one was younger, which is the way that kind of thing works. The older one would be basically the, can't think of the word. The older one would be in charge of receiving the inheritance and distributing it out to the other siblings. That's the one. He would be basically the equivalent of what we would call an executor. Don't know why I couldn't think of that. So not only does he go and very awkwardly and somewhat inappropriately ask his dad for his share of the inheritance, he also sidesteps his brother to do it. He essentially says, hey, Dad, you know what? Given the choice between your presence in my life or running off with your money that I'm supposed to get after you're dead, I'd rather run off with your money that I'm supposed to get after you're dead. How do you know that's what he would do with it? Well, because the Father gives it to him, and that's what he does with it. And you know the story. He winds up, he lives big for a while. Got a lot of friends around him as he's living big and spending money. But eventually he whittles it away to where he is working in basically slopping the hogs, which for a Jewish boy at the time would be really, really tough since pigs are considered unclean in the first place. And he's so hungry and so desperate that even as he's pouring the slop in the troughs for the hogs to eat, he looks at it and goes, that don't look that bad. And so he eventually comes to himself as he's considering eating pig slop. And he says, this is ridiculous. Look, even the hired hands at my dad's farm have it better than this. You know what? I know I'll burn my bridge as a son, but if I went back there and I offer the right apology and maybe he thinks my eyes look like my mom's eyes and that'll give me some goodwill, whatever. I'll go back, I'll make this apology, and maybe, I know I can't be a son anymore, but maybe he'll just hire me on as a hired hand, and I know they've got it better than this. So he starts the journey back. The scene shifts over to the father who's sitting on the porch. And every day he's been sitting there looking down the road, waiting for the merest glimpse of his son coming home. And then he sees him from afar off. And the father jumps up out of his chair and starts running towards him. Now, there's a couple of things that you need to understand. One thing in that society that older, respected men don't do is run because they don't have to. But the people listening to the story, they kind of see how that would work because this son has betrayed everything that his father stood for, has burned all his money. The only reason he's coming back is because he spent it. Actually, the narrator tells you that on the way home, he's rehearsing an apology. And I'm going to tell you, and you don't have to agree with me on this, but reading the narrative, and I ask you to do it yourself, it seems less like he's sorry and more like he's hungry. That's why he's rehearsing the apology. And so he gets back, and his dad takes off down the road, and everybody listening knows exactly what's going to happen now. That disrespectful son is going to get here. The father's running down the road to put him in his place. The thing that they would do is he would reach down, he would take off his shoe, and he would throw it at him, saying, "This is not." And you actually saw this several years ago when President Bush at the time was speaking over in the Middle East, and there was this weird scene when he was doing a press conference, and somebody started throwing shoes at him. It's because in that part of the world, that is a sign of disrespect. It's a sign of dishonor. And so they knew that that was what this father was going to do. And the narrative even talks about him starting to take off his shoes. And they're like, yeah, here it comes. And instead, he puts his own shoes on him. And he wraps him in his own cloak. And he embraces him. The son doesn't even get the apology out of his mouth. I don't know if you ever noticed that. He starts it. He doesn't get it out of his mouth. The father cuts him off and accepts him in and tells him to go kill the fatted calf so that they can have this huge party. But then we flash back to the other older brother, which most people have forgot about at this point, which is appropriate because he feels very forgotten. And he hears the party. I don't know if that means he hears the bass thumping through the tent walls or what, but he hears the party. And he goes over, he asks around, they're like, well, your brother came back and they threw a party. And so he goes to the tent, but he's so mad, he's so bitter that he won't even go inside. And so eventually the father starts asking around about where he is, and somebody lets him know that he's outside, so the father goes outside, and they have this conversation. And the older son lets him have it. How dare you? How dare you? I have been here this whole time. I've been slaving away for you. And you won't even give me an old goat to barbecue and have a party with my friends, you old goat. And the father says, wait, don't you understand? Everything I have was already yours. But your brother, who was essentially, for all practical purposes, dead to us, is alive again. He was lost and now he's found. We had no choice but to celebrate. Why don't you come in and join the party? And if this were a movie, this is the point where you would get so frustrated you would throw your popcorn at the screen. Because before the brother can answer, before you can see what he's going to do, the screen fades to black and the credits roll. It stops. Without resolving. Don't take my word for it. You can look at it. It just stops. Now, before we get to what's going on there and why that happened, let's walk through a couple more characters. Let's look at the younger son, because the younger son believes the story. In his story, the story he's telling, he's saying, I'm not worthy to be called my father's son. I'm not speculating on that. He actually says it in the story. The story he's telling is, I'm not worthy to be called my father's son. I've relinquished that. There's something about me, something I've done, something I've failed to do, all of the above, that makes me unworthy of love and connection in that way. I'm trying to get something better than what I got, but that's off the table. Now, listen to the story his father seems to be telling. His father tells a story of return and reconciliation. He was lost and now he's found. He was dead and now he's alive. His father tells a story of a loving father who never stopped loving and never stopped hoping, and every day sat outside and looked down the road because he wanted so desperately for his son to come back. Let me say it like this. He wanted so desperately for his son to choose to come back. And the story he's telling is the story of the restoration of a son. Now, do you see the difference in those two narratives? The story the son believes is, I'm no longer worthy to be called a son anymore. I'm not worthy of that kind of love and connection. And he's got a list of things that he can point at. Reasons why that's true. But the father has been keeps telling, is trying to tell to him a story of return and reconciliation, a turn of a relationship between a father and a son where the father never gave up, where the father was always hoping, where the father was longing for the return so that he would have the opportunity to restore the boy to full status as a son, which is what he wanted the whole time, and the boy chose to opt out of. So the younger son has to decide whose version of his story he's going to trust, his or his father's. One in which he's no longer worthy to be called a son, or the one in which he has a robe, a ring, and where he's a sandal-wearing son who was dead and is alive again, who was lost and has been found. There are two versions of his story, his and his father's. He has to choose which one he's going to live in, which one he will believe, which one he'll trust. But the same thing appears to be true about his older brother. So let's look at the older brother for a second. In the older son's story, the story he's telling is that he's been a slave for years, that his father was a stingy slave driver. That's what he straight up says to him. But listen to the story his father tells. You're always with me. We've always been together. And get this, everything I have is already yours. In response to, you wouldn't even give me a goat to, you're feeling fatted calf for that boy, and you wouldn't even give me a goat to cook? The response of the father is, no, it isn't. Well, here's why. The response of the father is, wait a minute, you're always with me. Everything I have is already yours. The goat, the fatted calf, everything. They were already yours. The only reason you didn't have access to them is because you kept believing the story that you were a slave and I was some kind of slave driver, instead of we were a part of a family together, I was the father and you were the son. Everything I have was already yours. The fact that you didn't have access to it was because of what you kept insisting. See, just because the son believed that about the father doesn't mean that it was true of him. The older son has basically two problems. Number one, he fundamentally misunderstands the father even though he's been with him the whole time. And he continues to look at that relationship through that lens that he chose, and it distorts reality. Number two, he's obsessed with the idea that the situation isn't fair. He's obsessed with what he's entitled to, what he feels he's earned, and what others haven't. What he deserves and others don't. Okay, you get that? His whole argument is, I've been here the whole time, I've been working my tail off, this flaky loser son of yours takes money that he wasn't even owed at the time, runs off and blows it, your hard-earned money. Betrayed all of the values that you have and that you've taught us, that allowed you to create this wealth and have all of this, and have something to pass down. He betrayed all of it. And I've been here the whole time. And you're having a big party and you're killing a fatted calf and you're doing this big thing for him? For the washout flake who came back with a flimsy apology and he just gets everything? It isn't fair. Now here's what I want you to note. The older brother's not wrong about that. It isn't fair. You see that, right? Though the son was flaky, he did blow all the money. He did ignore the principles that his father gave him. It's not fair. But here's what we need to wrap our heads around, and it's going to be a little tough at first. But it's going to become one of the beautiful, glorious truths that you actually hold on to. Grace isn't fair by definition. You get that? Grace is unmerited favor. It's not even on the same continuum. It opts out of being merit-based. Grace isn't fair. Mercy isn't fair. That's the implication of the word. If it's just people doing what people would naturally do, I don't even know that we would have a word for it. Grace isn't fair. Mercy isn't fair. God isn't fair, and you don't want him to be. We are all here by the grace of God. We are all here because God has washed us clean, erased our past, and given us a new way forward by his power, mercy, and grace through what he did through Jesus. We left fair behind. If you're wanting a religion with fairness, I recommend something other than Christianity. Because Christianity is about grace. Christianity is about unconditional love, unmerited favor. And we're called to bear the image of the God who gave that to all of us. So when we enter in through the door of grace, when we let that shame be washed away from us, we stop being everybody needs to get what they deserve people, because our whole existence is predicated on that not being true. It's predicated on the character of God the Father and what he wanted and the reality that he created for us that he invites us into but won't force us into. What story have you been telling yourself about God, about you? Do you keep feeding yourself the narratives about shame, that you're no longer worthy to be called a son or a daughter, that you're not worthy of that loving connection with God, with other people? Have you been telling yourself the story that, you know what? You've been here the whole time. You never left church. You slogged through. You've listened even when it's boring. You've sang songs that you didn't even like because it was important. You came when you were really tired and could have slept in. I have been here slaving away for you, Father, and now this jerk comes back after using his whole life to betray what you stand for, and you're going to throw a party and celebrate? Now, do you believe in a God that says, you're right, let's give that jerk what he deserves? Or do you believe in a Father who says, don't you understand? This brother or sister of yours, they were essentially dead to us and now they're alive. They were lost and now they're found. They had left, we'd become estranged, and now they've returned as my son or daughter and as your brother and sister. Don't you understand we had to celebrate? They've been set free from their self-imposed prison, and they've returned to their status as a part of this family. They've returned to life. See, the older brother's story doesn't allow for gifts or grace. His story doesn't allow for the Father he actually has. Instead, he reads him through a lens that distorts him into somebody other than who he really is. His Father hears him out, but note, his Father, who stands in for God, isn't remotely interested in fair. He's interested in grace, mercy, forgiveness, and reconciliation. And those roads don't go the same place. Let's finish up here. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, starting verse 18. To the Corinthian church, Paul says, all of this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation, that God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So to the Corinthian church, he explains, look, everything I've been talking about is from God who reconciled. Notice the tense of that verb. It's past tense. God reconciled, past tense. God did everything that was necessary, past tense, and invites us into it, present tense. Also, God who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So it's not just that God reconciled us to himself, it's that he then gives us the ministry of reconciliation. We have been told by God how much he values us, how much worth he thinks there is in us, and how worthy we are of love and connection because he declares it and he gets to. But that goes hand in hand with becoming then a part of that ministry of reconciliation, of reaching out and try to bring others into the same reconciliation that we experienced ourselves. We become agents of the thing that we receive. We become reflections of the thing that God gave to us. And so we're no longer remotely interested in fair or people getting what they deserve. What we want for them is to be reconciled to God and to their brothers and sisters. What we want for them is for them to fall in love with the way of Jesus and walk that way. What we want for them is to understand what it is to be a son or a daughter of God through the power of Christ. What we want for them is to be set free from sin and shame so they can live redeemed lives. We're not interested in fair anymore. We're interested in reconciliation. We're interested in salvation. We're interested in grace. We're interested in the power of God. And we have to believe stories that allow that both for ourselves and for the people around us. Or else we're back being rooted in shame and being dragged down into that. He says, God was reconciling, past tense again, the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against us. Not counting people's sins against them. And again, he comes back with that message of reconciliation. And then he says, and we are ambassadors. As people who have been brought into that, we become ambassadors of that reality to other people. And we're not going to shame them into following Jesus. You need to understand that. You can shame them for a while into meticulously following rules to try to avoid a punishment, but you can't shame them into following Jesus. You can't shame them into falling in love with Jesus. You can't shame them into loving the way of Jesus. And God never asked us to. Oh, one more thing. You know what I said about how the parable just kind of stops and the screen goes black and the credit rolls? I think that confused everybody there. They're so confused by this story. They thought at several points they knew how it was going to go. It did something completely different, and then it just stops without resolving. Here's why I think it was. Yeah, the part about the younger son to a large degree is to the tax collectors and notorious sinners that came there. He wanted them to know that that's how God feels about him. But the second punch of that story, and the reason why you end with the older brother, is this. The overall story is directed toward those Pharisees and religious leaders. And if we're not reading the Bible looking at the Pharisees and religious leaders and seeing them as a cautionary tale where there but for the grace of God go I, we're missing the point. He ends the story without resolving it. The father invites him into the party, and it doesn't let you know what the brother's going to do because it's supposed to occur to them probably in the middle of the night. They probably wake up out of a dead sleep that night because they finally realize, oh, I am the older brother. And the reason it isn't resolved is I decide how that story ends by what I do with my life. I decide whether I go into the party and celebrate with God or if I want to pout outside because I want it to be fair. Do I celebrate the grace of God, the redemption and reconciliation of those who seemed lost to us, or do I stand outside and pout and show how mad I am with a God who won't act like we know a respectable God ought to act? I don't know about you, but I'm going into the party. I don't know about you, but I'm going to try to reflect the grace and mercy that God has given me. And it doesn't mean that there's not a place for guilt. It doesn't mean that there's not a place that you don't call that out. Matter of fact, you are bound to call out injustice. But you do it in a way that still values the person, that wants redemption, salvation, and restoration as a child to God. We quit getting pulled into this stuff, and instead we reflect the God who's most clearly seen in Jesus, the God that we actually have. We embrace better stories because a lot of our old stories are distorting things and are keeping us from living the lives that God's called us to live, that God's wanted us to live all along. So may you quit believing the shame-soaked stories that you've been telling yourself. And may you instead embrace the story of love, grace, and reconciliation that the Father has been telling all along. May you believe with your whole heart that
Today at 5 o'clock this afternoon, we're going to have a cappella singing at Rocky Creek, and you're